course, the usual theory that we're all being told is that there is this new sort of novel virus called a coronavirus, and that is the cause of why everybody is getting sick. And I thought that the first step here is we should look at the history of how we know that a certain disease or a certain set of symptoms is caused by a microorganism at all, and then specifically by a virus, because that's really the place to start. And so the way that I would explain that, and this is basically formulated in a set of postulates that started in the essentially the early part of the last century, and they're called Koch's postulates. And these are the accepted way we prove that any set of symptoms is caused by a infectious agent. And they're used and essentially approved by all the infectious disease people and virologists in the world. So Koch's postulates are basically four. And let's take a very simple example so that everybody can understand this. It looks like a new disease. There's people who have a dry cough and low-grade fever and this shadowing on their CT scans of their lungs. We've never seen that before. Can you come and investigate to see if there's an infectious etiology? Okay, fair enough. So what I want you to do is line up 500 people, all with that same symptoms, and we're going to do an electron microscopy examination of their sputum and their blood, and we're going to find out if all of them have millions of copies of this, of a virus, and then we're going to characterize the virus and see what happens. The next thing I would do is I would ask them to take 500 people who are perfectly normal, because you need a control in this, and say, let's look at their blood and their sputum and see how many of them have millions of copies of the virus in their blood or their respiratory secretions. And the answer should be 100% of the first 500 have millions of copies, and 0 of the second group have this millions of copies. Then we would purify those millions of copies of the virus from the first group, find a susceptible animal and either inject it or put it in their nose or squirt it down their throat. We would do then a control, so we would take a saline solution or something like that and do the same thing, except it didn't have the virus. And if all of them got sick and all of them had millions of copies, we would prove that this was because of this new virus. So that's how this, quote, should have been done. Now let's look at how it was done. As far as we know, and where I'm getting this from is a search for PubMed, a search for articles, and people are sending me things to corroborate this, and so I would go to infectiousmyth.com. As far as we know, not only are there not 500 people who had this done, as far as I can tell, there was nobody who had this done. There was not a single person who had these symptoms who had millions of copies of coronavirus isolated from their blood or sputum. What they said was, and what they published, and I've seen the articles, is we have people who are sick. Here's a smear of their electron microscopy examination. And you see lots of things. You see cellular debris. You see a number of different things that look like viruses. And one of them looks like a coronavirus. And then they did not do an examination, an electron microscope of 500 normal people. They simply didn't do it. Now, the people who wrote the articles then said, and I quote, "We did not attempt to purify the virus," which, if you think about it, is mind-boggling. Because if they didn't purify the virus, how do they know that that was the cause of the disease? And the answer is there's no way to know that. But they did take the virus and they did a genetic sequence of it. The genetic material of a coronavirus is RNA, not DNA. And they said, this is a new genetic sequence which we haven't seen in a coronavirus before. Therefore, this is the cause of the disease. And all I can say is this flies in the face of everything we know about virology and infectious causation. Now, this same thing was, the same failure of evidence was done with the H1N1 situation. It was done with the H5N1 situation. It was done with SARS. It was done with Hep C. It was done with Ebola virus. It was done with Zika virus. This is not the first rodeo for the failure of the infectious disease community to follow the actual laws and rules that they set up to prove infectious etiology. So that's the first thing that I think everybody must understand. Now, a lot of you and a lot of people ask me the question, well, but don't we have a test that shows that this is caused by this virus? Now, sometimes, because I have a little bit of a smart alecky tendency, I must admit, I ask the people, do you know what the test was? Or do you know what the test is? So far, essentially, nobody has known what the test is. The test is called a RT-PCR test. It's otherwise known as a viral load test. And the test is a surrogate test. It was developed by a guy named Kary Mullis, who was given the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for essentially inventing the technique of this test. And he said very specifically, you cannot use this test to either prove infectious etiology or to diagnose an infectious disease, which of course is interesting because if you can't use it to diagnose an infectious disease, that of course begs the question of what can you use it for? But let me back up here and describe what a surrogate test means, because this is very important to understanding the situation we're currently in. A surrogate test means that in a situation where you're trying to prove causation, you have to have a gold standard test. So here's a way to understand this. Let's say you want to go to a town and you want to know how many feet there are in that town. And I don't mean inches and meters, I mean the feet at the bottom of your legs, right? So the question is, how many feet are there in Podunk, Alaska? So obviously the gold standard test for that is to go to the town, have everybody come to the town square, and then count their feet. So then you have 1,112 feet, and you know that that's accurate. And then you go to the next town, and you say, okay, everybody come to the center, 100% of the people come, you count their feet, and there's 3,240 feet. You do that 3 or 4 times, and you've now established a 100% foolproof way of knowing how many feet there are in that town. Now, in that situation, you can use a surrogate test. And so what do I mean by a surrogate test? Then you say, well, I don't want to count everybody's feet. I know that everybody who has a foot has a shoe, and everybody who has a shoe has a shoelace, and there's only one shoe store in town that sells shoelaces. So I'm going to go to that shoe store and see how many people bought shoelaces this year, and that's going to tell me how many feet there are. That's what's called a surrogate test. Now, the problem with a surrogate test is every one of those assumptions better be correct. So for instance, how do you know everybody has bought shoes? Because maybe somebody doesn't like shoes. And then how do you know that everybody only has one pair of shoes? I've heard there's women who like 4 pairs or 6 pairs. And what about if some of the shoes, like I have a pair of shoes that doesn't have shoelaces? So what happens with that? And the point of that is, unless you know all of those things, and unless you have a gold standard to which to compare it to, you cannot use a surrogate test to prove anything. And that is what is happening with these tests. So what is the surrogate test? So remember that we don't have a gold standard. We don't have isolation, purification, reinfection. We don't have viremia. We don't have millions of copies demonstrated on an electron microscope. We essentially have no idea who has this coronavirus disease. So then they take a piece of one of the coronaviruses, the new one that they found. It has a new RNA sequence that hasn't been found before. They take one of the sequences, which they say is unique to that particular virus, and they do something called amplify it. And what that means is you take in your blood, you'll have one copy of this sequence, and it's too small, you can't find it. So you stimulate it, and this is what Kary Mullis came up with. You stimulate it, it makes 2 copies, that's 1 cycle. You make 4 copies, that's 2. You make 2 to the 20th copies, whatever number that is, that's 20 cycles. And what you find with this test is that once you put it through approximately 36 cycles, then you start to see the color change that tells you it's positive. So if you do 35 cycles, it's still too small to see. If you do 36, you start to see it, but you get false negatives, even though you don't really know which is a false negative because you don't have anything to compare it with. So then you do 37 and you see it, 5% of the time of people with these symptoms, and you say that's the number. But here's where it gets interesting. If you do it 40 times, you start seeing a lot more positives. And then here's something else to know. If you do it 60 times, so if you amplify it over and over and over again, it becomes positive with 100% of the people. Let me say that again. If you amplify it 60 times, it will be positive with everybody. That means that everybody has a piece of this RNA somewhere in their cells or in their genome or somewhere in their secretions. All you have to do is amplify it enough. And the problem is we don't know how many false positives or false negatives there are because we have nothing to compare it to. And if all biological tests have false positives, so if you test 30 million people and you have a 1% false positive rate, then 300,000 people by definition will test positive, and then you have an epidemic. And then if you want to demonstrate that the epidemic got better, all you have to do is lower the amplification cycles to 35, and then suddenly your vitamin C or your vaccine or your chloroquine or whatever you did worked, and now there's no more people testing positive. That is fraught with problems, and that is the problem. And unfortunately, with every country has their own standard of what kind of cycles they put it through, the number. So you see very different numbers coming out of very different places, depending on the number of amplification cycles that they're standardizing their test to. And I hope everybody is getting the point that this is a crazy situation.